The rope dug into his waist. Scholar Chen sat rigid at his desk, tied to the ceiling beam above him. If his head drooped from exhaustion, the rope would jerk him awake. Around him, other students had their own desperate methods. One held a sharp awl, jabbing his thigh whenever his mind wandered. Another balanced on a stool with only 2 legs touching the ground, forcing constant alertness or painful collapse. This was the Tang Dynasty imperial examination system. These young men were studying texts so dense and boring that staying awake felt impossible. Yet their entire futures depended on memorizing every word. One slip in the examination meant disgrace. Not just for them, but for every generation of their family who had sacrificed to put them here. Chen had tried everything. He woke at dawn. He studied past midnight. He copied the 5 classics by hand until his fingers cramped. He recited passages aloud until his voice went hoarse. He drank bitter tea that burned his throat and made his heart race. Nothing worked. The moment his eyes touched the page, his mind scattered like birds startled from a tree. Then one night, something unexpected happened. An old monk was passing through, and he stopped to watch the students in their torture. He said nothing for a long time. Then he walked to Chen's desk and did something strange. He untied the rope. "Sit naturally," he said. Chen protested. Without the rope, he would fall asleep. The monk smiled. "You will not fall asleep. You will learn more in 1 hour than you have learned in a month of fighting yourself." What the monk taught Chen that night was not what anyone expected. It was not a trick. It was not motivation. It was 5 principles that the monasteries had used for centuries to help monks memorize thousands of sutras, word for word, without force and without exhaustion. Within 3 weeks, Chen's ability to focus had transformed completely. But here's the twist. It was not because he learned to concentrate harder. It was because he learned to stop concentrating. This reveals something important about focus. The moment you treat boring material as an enemy to defeat through willpower, you create the exact resistance that makes focusing impossible. You are not commanding your attention. You are fighting it. And in that fight, you always lose. Most students today follow the same pattern Chen followed before he met the monk. You sit down with determination. You promise yourself you will focus for the next hour. Within minutes, your attention drifts. You notice you have been thinking about something else. You criticize yourself for weak discipline. You force your eyes back to the page. The cycle repeats. Each time your mind wanders, you add another layer of frustration and judgment. Soon, you are not just fighting the boring material. You are fighting your own mind, your emotions, and the mounting evidence that you cannot control your attention through will alone. The Chinese approach begins from a completely different understanding. Focus is not something you force. It is something you allow by removing the obstacles that block it. The first principle the monk taught Chen was Xin Zhai, which means fasting of the heart. This comes from the Zhuangzi, one of the foundational Taoist texts. Before attempting to study boring material, you must first empty yourself of the expectation that it should be interesting. This sounds simple, but it changes everything. The resistance you feel toward boring material comes from a specific thought. This should be more interesting than it is. That thought creates tension. You are demanding that reality be different than it is. This demand is what makes focusing feel like a battle. Xin Zhai teaches you to approach the material with a mind that expects nothing. You acknowledge directly that the text is boring. You do not pretend otherwise. You do not try to manufacture false enthusiasm. You simply note the fact without judgment. This text is dry. That is true. Now I will read it anyway. This removes the layer of resistance that comes from fighting against boredom itself. You are no longer reading while simultaneously wishing you were doing something else. You are simply reading. a medical student in Beijing, used this method to study anatomy. The textbook was incredibly dense and tedious. Instead of trying to psych herself up or find it interesting, she would sit down and say aloud, "This is boring, and I am going to read it anyway." This acknowledgement removed the internal argument. She stopped wasting energy fighting the fact that it was boring. She could use that energy for actual reading. Within a month, her retention had doubled, not because the material became interesting, but because she stopped creating resistance against its nature. The second principle is Wu Nian, which means no thought or empty mind. This appears in both Taoist philosophy and Chan Buddhism. Wu Nian does not mean blanking your mind. It means studying without the constant commentary your mind adds to everything you read. When you read a boring passage, your mind typically generates a stream of reactions. This is pointless. Why do I need to know this? I will never use this. I should be studying something else. This commentary uses the same mental resources you need for actually processing information. You cannot focus on the text while also running this internal dialogue about the text. Wu Nian practice involves catching these commentary thoughts and releasing them without engagement. You notice the thought, "This is pointless," and you simply let it pass without arguing with it or believing it. You return attention to the actual words on the page, not to your opinions about those words, just the words themselves. The ancient monks would practice this by reading texts they found boring and treating each wandering thought as a meditation object. When the mind said, "This is tedious," they would note thinking and return to the text. When the mind said, "I will never remember this," they would note thinking and return to the text. Over time, the gap between wandering thoughts grew longer. They could read for increasing periods, with attention resting directly on the material, rather than on their reactions to it. Here is where Chen discovered something surprising. After 3 days of practicing Xin Zhai and Wu Nian, he noticed that what he called boring was actually two different things. The text itself was neutral. The boredom was his mind's reaction to the text. Once he stopped fueling the reaction, the text became simply words on a page. Not interesting, not boring, just information to process. The third principle is Zhuanzhu, which means concentration of mind or focused attention. This addresses a specific problem modern students face. When studying boring material, you often split your attention. Part of you reads, while another part plans what you will do when this session ends. Another part checks how much time has passed. Another part judges your performance. You are trying to walk 5 paths at once and wondering why you keep stumbling. Zhuanzhu means choosing one direction and closing all others for a set period. Before you begin studying, you decide exactly how long you will work. 20 minutes, 30 minutes, whatever feels manageable. During that time, you close all other paths. You are not planning. You are not evaluating. You are not watching the clock. You are only reading. This complete commitment to focused attention, even for a short time, creates a depth of focus that hours of divided attention never achieve. A law student struggling with case memorization applied this principle by studying in blocks of 25 minutes with complete commitment. She removed her phone from the room. She turned her chair away from the clock. She made an agreement with herself. For these 25 minutes, there is only this textbook. Nothing else exists. She found. She learned more in 3 focused blocks of 25 minutes than in 2 hours of distracted studying where part of her attention was always elsewhere. The fourth principle is Zhongyang, finding the middle way. This comes from Confucian philosophy and is one of the most important concepts in Chinese thought. It means appropriate measure or dynamic balance. Most students make studying boring material harder by approaching it with the wrong energy level. You either try to force intense concentration, which exhausts you quickly, or you read in a fog of low energy that allows constant distraction. Neither extreme works well. Zhongyang teaches you to find the middle state. alert but not straining, engaged but not forcing. This requires you to check your energy level before you study and adjust your approach accordingly. If your energy is low, you do not try to force high-intensity focus. You study lighter material or break the boring content into smaller pieces. If your energy is scattered, you do not just push through. You take 5 minutes to settle your mind first through breathing or walking. The monk taught Chen to assess his energy state honestly before each study session. When Chen noticed his energy was low, he would study for shorter periods with more breaks. When his energy was good, he could sustain attention for longer. This flexibility prevented the common pattern of forcing yourself to study when your energy state makes effective focus nearly impossible. And here, Chen discovered the second twist. The rope he had used to force himself awake was actually making him more tired. The constant tension, the judgment, the fight against his own nature, all of this was draining his energy faster than the studying itself. Without the rope, without the fight, he had more energy available for actual learning. The fifth principle is Ran Ran, which means gradual unfolding or natural emergence. This principle addresses the mistake of expecting immediate deep focus. Your attention is like water that needs time to settle. When you first sit down with boring material, your mind is still carrying momentum from whatever you were doing before. Trying to force instant focus is like demanding that stirred water become clear immediately. Ran practice means allowing a transition period. You sit down with your boring text and you read without any expectation of perfect focus for the first few minutes. You are simply reading. Your attention will wander. That is expected. You gently bring it back. You are not trying to achieve focus. You are allowing focus to emerge naturally as your mind settles into the rhythm of reading. Usually, within 5 to 7 minutes, if you remain patient with the process, attention deepens on its own. A philosophy student used this approach with texts she found impenetrable. Instead of forcing herself to understand from the first sentence, she would read the first page or two with no pressure to comprehend or retain anything. She was just exposing her mind to the material and letting it settle into the language and rhythm. By the third page, her comprehension would improve naturally because her attention had been allowed to find its depth rather than being commanded to focus immediately. These 5 principles work together to create a different relationship with boring material. You are not conquering boredom through willpower. You are understanding the conditions that allow natural focus to emerge, and then creating those conditions deliberately. The ancient monks could memorize vast amounts of tedious material, not because they had superior discipline, but because they understood how attention actually works. Chen passed his examination. But what surprised him more was this. After practicing these 5 principles for months, he noticed that nothing felt truly boring anymore. The texts had not changed. His relationship to them had changed. He discovered that boredom was not a property of the material. It was a property of how he approached the material. An approach could be changed. This is the final revelation. The problem was never that the material was boring. The problem was that you believed you needed to fight boredom to focus. The fight itself was what made focus impossible. Here is how you can apply these principles today. 1. Before you study boring material, practice Xin Zhai by acknowledging directly that it is boring and that you will study it anyway. This removes the resistance of fighting against its nature. 2. During study sessions, practice Wu Nian by noticing when your mind adds commentary to what you are reading and gently returning attention to the actual words. 3. Use Zhuanzhu by choosing a specific time block and committing completely to that focused attention with all other options closed. 4. Apply Zhongyong by honestly assessing your energy state before studying and adjusting your approach, rather than forcing one strategy regardless. of your condition. 5. Allow Ran by giving yourself 5 minutes at the start of each session to settle into focus, rather than demanding immediate perfect attention. You do not need to battle your mind into submission. You only need to understand how it naturally settles into focus when you stop creating the conditions that prevent it. The sages did not force the river to flow. They understood its nature and moved with it. Write in the comments, "I choose alignment over force." Thank you for watching.